Good morning. Over the past 11 months, some words have taken on greater meaning. It's not that they're new words, the word I'm thinking of has been in the dictionary a long time. It's more their definition expands beyond its existing scope to become synonymous with the times we're living through. This word has been trending through the corridors of power, from government to national corporations. It's been hashtagging exponentially on news feeds to social media platforms. It's even entered the vocabulary of the church. And maybe you've found it being spoken from your lips. It's the word pivot. Through this pandemic, the word pivot has been asked in the form of a question, which can apply to all contexts of life, from family relationships and friendships to work and the corporate life, your personal life, even your spiritual life. For many, being able to answer this question successfully, can we pivot, has been life-changing, and you'll never go back to old ways again. Jesus too knew how powerful it could be to ask someone a question. He knew how asking a question could be the key to pivoting, to unlocking transformation in anyone's life, in your life. It's why, therefore, we've been looking at 4 of these questions over recent weeks and seeing how they were life-changing for those to whom they were addressed. In the same way, the questions Jesus asked brought life changed for those people in their original context. So likewise, by how we answer these same questions, Jesus can equally enable you to pivot spiritually, to unveil a new chapter and change the trajectory of your life. In fact, of all of the questions Jesus asked, today's question is the one by which how we answer it, your whole life will pivot. So here's the scene before us. Jesus and his disciples are travelling from Galilee and in northern Israel, and they're going even further north to the area of Caesarea Philippi, which sits at the southwestern base of Mount Hermon. And as they're walking, Jesus begins a conversation by, yes, you've guessed it, asking a question, which goes similar to when you hear people talk about me, what do they say? Or to be more precise, who do they say I am? There's a common consensus to the disciples' response, which had been heard previously as well in a different story. It centres upon the idea of Jesus being a prophet. Maybe James said, they say you're John the Baptist. Maybe John said, they say you're Elijah. Maybe Thomas said, they say you're one of the great prophets of the Old Testament. Now, in case you've forgotten or you aren't aware, last year when we looked at the Old Testament prophets, we defined the role of the prophet as being to stand in the gap and provide a map to God for the people through their messages, through their actions and through their prayers. In essence, prophets acted as a hinge, as a pivot. From what the people had seen and what they could articulate, Jesus should be in the same company. He ticked all the boxes of the criteria of being a great and worthy prophet. For instance, we read, when it came to Jesus' messages, the people were astounded at Jesus' teaching. He taught them as one having authority and not as the scribes. We read when it came to Jesus' actions, the people were amazed. Whether from casting out demons to healing the blind, the lame and the sick. When it came to Jesus' prayers, the people heard and felt his Father's presence. Now though, Jesus returns with a second question. If the first was general, the second is personal to those on that walk. Now no more what others think, but what you think. But who do you say I am? It's Peter, as he frequently found himself, who becomes the group spokesperson, and once more, if nothing else, because he was better at opening his mouth first. For the disciples, they too had equally been astounded at Jesus' messages, but they'd also been privileged to learn from the everyday conversations with him in private. The disciples too had been amazed by Jesus' actions, having also seen some spectacular private demonstrations, the calming of the storm, the walking on the water. The disciples too had felt the power of Jesus' prayers, so much so that they'd asked for private lessons from Jesus on how to pray, because nobody prayed like him. So on behalf of them all, Peter declares what Mark had said at the very beginning of the gospel and what Jesus will finally say at the end. You are the Messiah. To use the Messiah word in those days was like pouring oxygen on an open fire. It was explosive and incendiary. It would attract attention and invite opposition. But this wasn't why Jesus told them not to tell anyone. As yet, it was not the right time. There was still work to do, which was to begin immediately with challenging and correcting Jesus' closest followers about what it meant to be the Messiah. Messiah is a Hebrew word. I'm sure we all know the corresponding Greek word is Christ. Both words mean the anointed one or special one. To the Jews, and remember, the disciples were Jews, from the Old Testament scriptures and other ancient Jewish documents, the Messiah would be the Son of God. He would be God's anointed king from the royal line of David, who would, amongst other things, destroy Israel's pagan enemies and free them from opposition in their land. So when Jesus then outlines next how he will be rejected and be killed before rising again, it's all too much for Peter, and for Peter read the rest of the disciples to come to terms with. The Messiah suffering greatly? No. The Messiah being rejected? What? The Messiah being killed? Surely not. This isn't how the script is meant to go. But Jesus is outlining this is exactly how the story will go. And what follows is a stern rebuke for Peter and the rest of the disciples to get in line. In many ways, Peter's reaction is typical of the healing of the blind man in two stages in the preceding story to this one. Peter saw something, but he had not yet understood everything. And as we know, for Peter, this dawning would still take some time to arrive. As Peter would equally find out, Jesus' question only becomes pivotal and life-changing when it isn't so much answered by words, which can be cheap, but when it's declared in our actions, which raises the bar to new heights. It's only when you respond with your mouth, you are the Messiah, and declare it with your actions, it leads you to pivot and a life-changing experience. So Jesus then concludes by outlining, not only for the disciples' benefit, but the watching world as well, now what this life change looks like to declare him as the Messiah. It means to pivot and follow him, whoever we are, in whatever we face and wherever we're sent. It's a call to answer the question which is open to all, whoever we are. It's a call to answer the question and to think beyond oneself in whatever situation. It's a call to answer the question and, no matter the cost, go wherever we're sent. Jesus said, "If any want to be my followers, let them deny themselves." What does it mean to deny oneself? Well, as some of you know, since the start of the new year, I've given up chocolate. It's now day 45. You could say, in one sense, I've been denying myself. But what Jesus is calling for in self-denial is on a different level altogether from giving up chocolate. It's not the denial of something to the self, but the denial of the self itself. In the original Greek context, it means to refuse to be guided by one's own interests and to surrender control of one's destiny. What Jesus is thus asking for is a radical abandonment of our own identity and self-determination. It's the extreme opposite and radically countercultural to the Western philosophy today, which promotes it's all about me. When we respond to Jesus' question in this way, it's not all about me. And you'll pivot. It will be life-changing for you. Jesus said, "If anyone wants to be my followers, let them deny themselves and take up their cross. What does it mean to take up your cross? Does it mean to endure hardship patiently and accept discomfort? Definitely. Does it mean more than this? Absolutely. Does it mean to join Jesus on the way to execution? Of course. Does it mean the possibility of literal death for me? Yes, maybe not likely, but many have and still do today. Jesus said, "If any want to be my followers, let them deny themselves and take up their cross and follow me." When we respond in this way to this question of Jesus, to borrow another metaphor in the Bible, we run with perseverance the race set before us. We all have a different race to run in following Jesus, but we all follow him down the same path, to be ready to share in the same fate, even carrying our own cross. The answer to the question, "Who do you say I am?" is never to be taken lightly. Words can be cheap. For many, it's one of come and die. Yes to self, and yes for so many often to a life of persecution. As Jesus goes on to say, for those who want to save their life will lose it. For those who lose their life for my sake and for the sake of the gospel will save it. For what will it profit them to gain the whole world and forfeit their life? Indeed, what can they give in return for their life? One thinks of Richard Wurmbrand, an atheist who answered Jesus' question today and became a pastor in Romania, and for whom words would mean nothing, living through the era of the brutal Ceausescu totalitarian government. As a result, it was by his actions his life changed, and it led him to be imprisoned and tortured for 17 years, many of them in solitary confinement. When he was asked what he'd learnt from those 17 years, he said he'd forgotten most of his Bible, but there are 3 things he knew. There is a God, Jesus is his son, the Messiah, and love is the best way. I love those first apprentices saw being demonstrated as Jesus the Messiah hung on the cross he'd carried to save the world. Still today, those who've answered this question, "Who do you say I am?" with a response, "You are the Messiah," suffer. The most persecuted group in the world today, irrespective of race or gender or sexuality or religion, is the follower of Jesus Christ. Maybe as many as 300 million people. One thinks of Dr. Sasser, who was in St. Juan again only 15 months ago and who answered Jesus' question and who's overcome repeated adversity in his life to pivot and found pioneering and life-changing work of health and hope in the villages of Myanmar, and who's now had to flee the country following the recent coup by the military. One thinks of the American missionary Jim Elliot and his 4 friends who answered Jesus' question and went to the jungle in Ecuador, having heard these words, and were savagely martyred by Auca Indians. Perhaps Jim Elliot's most famous quote was based on Jesus' words here. "He is no fool who gives what he cannot keep to gain what he cannot lose." Of all the questions Jesus asked, do you see now why this is the most life-changing? Your life cannot fail to pivot if you respond by declaring him as the Messiah. In closing, many choose to answer Jesus' question, "Who do you say I am?" the easy way. They respond as many did in the Bible and have throughout the centuries and still today by saying, "Jesus is a great prophet." But even men like Gandhi and Muhammad would say the same, and it didn't cause them to pivot, and it won't lead to life change for you. It was C.S. Lewis who said about this question, to take it seriously, we can only respond in one of 4 ways, because Jesus never intended to be considered a great prophet or wonderful moral teacher. Either Jesus was a liar, in other words, he wasn't the Messiah, or he was a lunatic, in other words, he was mad for suggesting he was the Messiah, Or he was a legend. In other words, he was made up, but the evidence for Jesus' existence is insurmountable, and the evidence for what he says in the gospel is beyond anything found not only from those days, but probably at least 15 centuries later, if not longer. Or he really was who he claimed to be, the Messiah. It's only when we respond in this way, by declaring him the Messiah of our life, your life changes. Now you know this. Are you ready to pivot? Shall we pray together? Jesus Christ, our risen Lord, may we run with perseverance the race set before us, with our eyes on you, the Messiah. May we follow your example, to deny ourselves, to take up our cross, and follow down the path you ask. In your name, amen.